Let go of my daughter. I said let you over her. The woman is screaming. Her voice is raw. Her hands are shaking. She is standing in the middle of the sidewalk in broad daylight, pulling her 6-year-old daughter away from a man in a suit who is crouched down on the concrete next to a pile of black garbage bags, broken furniture, and a torn stuffed rabbit that is missing one eye. People are walking past. Nobody is stopping. A woman nearby pulls out her phone, not to call for help, to record. The little girl is not crying. She is just holding the man's hand, tight, like she has known him her whole life. The man looks up slowly. He is calm, too calm for a man being screamed at in public. He does not let go of the child's hand right away. He looks at the mother with eyes that are not afraid and not angry, just steady. He says 3 words. She was alone. The mother stops screaming. Her chest is heaving. Her work uniform is wrinkled. Her name tag is still on. She looks at her daughter. She looks at the pile of everything she owns dumped on a public sidewalk. She looks at the stranger in a suit that costs more than her monthly rent, and something in her face breaks open. She does not cry. Not yet. She just stands there in the middle of the sidewalk looking at the life she built being swallowed by the concrete, and she whispers something so quietly the man almost does not catch it. She says she was supposed to be at school. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly who this was made for. Before we go any further, please take 2 seconds right now and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs a good story today, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what is happening on this sidewalk, you need to know who this woman is, who this child is, and who exactly is the man in the suit. Her name is not important right now. What is important is what she carries. She is 34 years old, and she has been carrying the weight of 2 people since her daughter was 18 months old. That was the year her husband went to work one Tuesday morning and never came home. Not because he left. Not because he chose something else. Because a drunk driver ran a red light at 7:42 in the morning, and that was the end of that. The end of the plan. The end of the dream. The end of the version of her life where someone else shared the load. She did not fall apart. She could not afford to. There was a baby watching her face every single day, learning how to feel safe in the world. And so she decided that her face would always say safe even when her chest was saying something completely different. She got a job at a hotel. Housekeeping, 6 days a week. She woke up at 4:30 every morning, dropped her daughter at her neighbor Miss Patterson's apartment on the 3rd floor, took 2 buses across the city, and spent 8 hours making other people's beds, cleaning other people's bathrooms, and folding other people's towels into the shape of swans. She did not complain about this. She was grateful for it. The apartment she lived in was small. 2 rooms. The heat worked sometimes. The hot water worked most times. The landlord, a man named Gerald, who wore the same yellow shirt every time she saw him and always smelled faintly of cigarettes and disappointment, had been raising her rent every 6 months for 2 years. Each time she paid it. Each time she had less left over. Each time she smiled at her daughter at the dinner table and said, "Things are fine, baby. Things are fine." But things were not fine. Things had not been fine for a long time. 3 weeks before the day on the sidewalk, Gerald slid a notice under her door. It was printed on yellow paper. It said she owed $420 in back fees she had never been told about. Maintenance fees, building fees, fees that had apparently always existed but had never appeared on any piece of paper before that moment. The notice said she had 14 days to pay or vacate the premises. She read that notice 5 times standing in her kitchen in her socks at 11 o'clock at night after her daughter was asleep. Then she folded it neatly, put it in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus, and went to bed. She was not in denial. She was strategizing. She was a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford. And so, instead of panicking, she made lists. She called her bank. She called her sister in Ohio, who had 3 kids of her own and not much more than she had. She called the city housing office and sat on hold for 47 minutes before someone told her the process would take 6 to 8 weeks, and there was nothing immediate they could do. She went to Gerald. She knocked on his door on a Saturday morning, and she stood in his doorway, and she explained clearly and calmly that the fees he was charging were not in her lease agreement. She had the lease with her. She had highlighted the relevant sections. Gerald looked at the lease. Then he looked at her. Then he said, "You can take it up with my lawyer if you want, or you can pay and stay." She paid what she could. She was $210 short. That was 2 weeks ago. On the morning of the day, everything ended up on the sidewalk. She kissed her daughter goodbye at Miss Patterson's door, took her 2 buses across the city, spent 8 hours making other people's beds, and came home. She turned the corner onto her street at 5:43 in the evening, and she stopped walking, because there on the sidewalk in front of her building was everything she owned: the bags, the boxes, the broken chair she had been meaning to fix for a year, her daughter's drawings in a plastic sleeve, the stuffed rabbit with one eye that her daughter refused to sleep without and had slept with every single night since she was 2 years old. And sitting on top of the pile, cross-legged, in her school uniform, holding the one-eyed rabbit to her chest, was her 6-year-old daughter. Miss Patterson was not there. She found out later that Gerald had called the school pretending to be her, said there was a family emergency, and had them release the child early. Miss Patterson had not been home, and so the school had taken the little girl to the building where Gerald met her, handed her the stuffed rabbit from the pile, and told her to wait for her mommy. That was 2 hours before she turned the corner. Her daughter had been sitting alone on that sidewalk for 2 hours, and that is the moment the man in the suit walked past. He was not supposed to be on that block. He was not supposed to be walking anywhere. He had a driver. He had always had a driver. But that afternoon his driver had taken a wrong turn trying to avoid construction, and he had gotten out of the car 2 blocks back, because he had a call to take, and he preferred to walk and think rather than sit still when his mind was moving fast. He had not been paying attention to the street. He was thinking about numbers, about a deal in Singapore that was going sideways, about a board meeting the following morning that he was not looking forward to. His phone was in his hand, and his eyes were slightly downward, and he would have walked straight past that pile on the sidewalk if the little girl had not said something. She did not cry. She did not ask for help. She just said, quietly and very matter-of-factly, the way only very small children who are trying very hard to be brave can say something, "That's my rabbit. His name is Captain." He stopped walking. He looked at the child. Then he looked at the pile. Then he looked up at the building. Then he looked back at the child. He asked her where her mommy was. She said mommy was at work, but she was coming soon. He asked her how long she had been waiting. She thought about it very seriously and said, "Since Paw Patrol." He did not know exactly what time Paw Patrol came on, but he understood that it had been a long time for a 6-year-old to be sitting alone on a sidewalk with a one-eyed rabbit. He looked at his phone. He looked down the street. He looked at the child again. And then he sat down, right there on the concrete, next to the pile of black garbage bags and broken furniture. In his suit, that cost more than most people's rent. He just sat down next to her and said, "I'll wait with you." The little girl looked at him for a long moment, the way children do when they are deciding whether to trust someone. Then she held out the rabbit and said, "You can hold Captain if you want." He took the rabbit. He held it carefully, like it was something important, because it was. They sat there together, the billionaire and the 6-year-old, on the sidewalk, for 22 minutes until her mother turned the corner. And that is when the screaming started. After she understood that the man had not taken her daughter anywhere, had not tried to do anything except sit with a child who was alone and afraid and pretending not to be, something shifted in her. She did not apologize for screaming. She was a mother. Mothers do not apologize for that. But she stopped shaking, and she pulled her daughter into her arms, and she held her so tight the little girl made a small sound of protest. The man stood up from the concrete and brushed off the back of his suit. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the pile of belongings on the sidewalk, and then he looked at her and he asked one question. He said, "Where are you going tonight?" She did not answer right away, because the honest answer was that she did not know. She had been too busy working all day to have solved that problem yet. Her sister was in Ohio. Miss Patterson's apartment was a 1-bedroom with no space. The shelter across town had a wait list she had called about 3 weeks ago, and they said, maybe by the end of the month. She said, "We'll figure out." He looked at her the way people look at someone who just said something that is technically true, but actually isn't. Then he did something she did not expect. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not offer money. He took out his phone and he made a call, and he said into the phone, very quietly, "I need the Harrison Suite held for 2 nights, under a guest. I'll explain later." Then he hung up and he looked at her and he said, "There's a hotel 2 blocks from here. The room is paid for. You and your daughter can stay while you figure out your next step. No strings." She stared at him. He said, "The Harrison is on Maple. The front desk will have your name. What name should I give them?" She did not give him her name for a long time. She just looked at him, because she had learned very carefully over the last 5 years that nothing came without strings, that kindness from strangers was either a mistake or a transaction waiting to reveal itself, that men in suits who sat on sidewalks next to small children and paid for hotel rooms were not real. They did not exist on her street, in her life, in her world. Her daughter tugged her sleeve and said, "Mommy, he held captain the whole time." She looked at her daughter. Then she looked at the man. She gave him her name. He nodded. He looked at the pile on the sidewalk and then at her, and he said, "I'll have someone come for your things in the morning. They'll be stored safely." Then he straightened his jacket one more time, and he said, "You should get her inside. It's getting cold." And then he walked away, just like that. No card, no number, no explanation of who he was or why he had done any of it. He just walked away down the street and turned the corner and was gone. She stood there on the sidewalk holding her daughter and her daughter's rabbit, and she looked at the spot where he had been sitting, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like someone had seen her, not her situation, not her need, not her problem. Her, the woman standing inside all of it. She picked up her daughter and carried her 2 blocks to the Harrison Hotel on Maple Street. And when she walked through those glass doors in her wrinkled work uniform with her name tag still on, the woman at the front desk looked up and smiled like she had been expected and said, "We have you right here. Suite 412. Is there anything your daughter needs tonight?" She almost fell apart right there in the lobby. She held it together because her daughter was watching her face to learn how to feel safe in the world. And so her face said safe. But when she got to Suite 412 and she put her daughter in the bath and she sat on the edge of the enormous bed in that beautiful quiet room, and she finally had a single moment alone, her shoulders came down from around her ears for the first time in what felt like years, and she put her face in her hands and she let herself feel everything she had been carrying since she turned that corner and saw her whole life on the sidewalk and her baby sitting on top of it alone. She cried for exactly 4 minutes. She counted. Then she washed her face and went to get her daughter out of the bath. She did not know his name. She did not know that he was one of the 12 wealthiest men in the state. She did not know that he owned the Harrison Hotel. She did not know that the Harrison Suite she was sitting in cost $3,200 a night. She did not know that after he walked away from that sidewalk, he had stopped at the corner and looked back once before he turned, and that he had stood there looking back for longer than he intended. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was that her daughter was safe and warm and had eaten the room service grilled cheese and fruit plate that arrived 40 minutes after they checked in, and was now asleep in the big white bed holding Captain the One-Eyed Rabbit. And what she knew was that tomorrow she had to figure out the rest of her life. She set her alarm for 4:30. Old habit. Then she lay down next to her daughter in the big white bed and put her arm around her and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay there listening to her daughter breathe, and she thought about Gerald and the yellow notice and the lease she had highlighted and the $420 she did not have in the city housing office and the 6 to 8 weeks, and she made her list in her head the way she always did, the way she had done since that Tuesday morning 5 years ago when the world rearranged itself without asking her permission. She was not a woman who waited to be rescued. That is important to understand. She was not lying in that hotel bed hoping the man in the suit would come back and make everything okay. She was lying in that hotel bed, making a plan. But somewhere underneath the plan, in the quiet place she did not usually let herself visit, she was also thinking about a man who sat down on a concrete sidewalk in a $3,000 suit because a little girl was alone and he could not make himself walk past. She fell asleep thinking about that. Across the city, in an apartment on the 47th floor with floor floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that people paid to look at. The man in the suit was sitting at his kitchen counter at midnight eating cold takeout, and looking at his phone, and not at the Singapore deal, and not at the board meeting notes. He was thinking about a woman in a wrinkled uniform with a name tag still on, standing on a sidewalk looking at her whole life in garbage bags, and saying we'll figure out with the kind of quiet certainty that told him she had been figuring things out alone for a very long time. He did not know why he could not stop thinking about this. He was not a man who got distracted easily. He had built his entire life and his entire company on the discipline of not getting distracted, on keeping his eyes on the next thing, and the next thing, and the thing after that. Feelings were not efficient. Detours were expensive. Getting involved in strangers' problems was not something he did, except that today he had sat on a sidewalk for 22 minutes holding a one-eyed rabbit named Captain. He put down the takeout. He looked out at the city lights for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his assistant and said, "Find out who owns the building on Carver Street, the one with the evictions today." His assistant did not ask why. That was what made her good at her job. He hung up and finished the cold takeout and went to bed. He did not sleep well either. In the morning she woke up before her daughter. She lay there for a moment looking at the ceiling of the most beautiful room she had ever slept in, and the ceiling looked back at her and reminded her that this was temporary, that today was the day, that the list she had made in her head last night needed to become action. She showered in the marble bathroom, using the small bottles of shampoo carefully, because something in her could not stop being careful even in a room where everything was already paid for. She put her uniform back on. She woke her daughter gently and helped her dress, and they sat together at the small table by the window, eating the complimentary breakfast that had been left outside their door on a tray, and her daughter asked if they lived here now. She said, "Just for a little while, baby." Her daughter thought about this and then said, "Can Captain live here too?" She said yes. Captain could live here too. She called her supervisor at the hotel where she worked and explained that she had a family emergency and needed the morning off. Her supervisor was a woman who had worked her way up from housekeeping herself, and she said, "Take what you need." Then she called the city housing emergency line. She called the legal aid office. She called her sister. She made the calls in order of importance the way she always made her calls. She did not leave a voicemail without a clear, specific question. She did not end a call without a next step. She was methodical and calm, and her daughter sat beside her on the bed, drawing in a hotel notepad with a complimentary pen. By 11 in the morning, she had 3 possible next steps. None of them were good. None of them were fast. All of them required time and paperwork and patience. She was not surprised. This was how things worked when you were on the wrong side of the system. You could be completely right, and it still moved slowly. She was sitting with her notes spread on the bed when the hotel phone rang. Nobody knew she was here except the man from the sidewalk. She stared at the phone for 3 rings before she answered it. It was a front desk. They said a gentleman had left something for her at reception. She asked what it was. They said it was an envelope. She took her daughter downstairs by the hand and walked to the front desk, and they handed her a cream-colored envelope with her name on it written in handwriting that was neat and slightly formal. She opened it standing right there at the desk. Inside was a single card. On the card was a name, an address, and a time. 2 o'clock today. And below the address, in that same neat handwriting, just 5 words. Someone looked into your lease. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the woman behind the desk, who smiled pleasantly and gave away nothing. She looked back down at the card. She did not know what that meant. She did not know if she should go. She did not know this man, and she did not know what someone looking into her lease meant, or what the address on the card was, or what would happen at 2 o'clock. But she had been a woman who made good decisions under pressure for 5 years. And something in her chest, the part that was not a list, told her to go. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the card. She asked the woman at the front desk if there was a babysitter service available, and the woman said yes, of course, and it was already arranged. She went. The address on the card was not an office building. It was a brownstone on a quiet street with window boxes, and a black door, and a small brass number. She stood on the step for a moment before she rang the bell. She was still in her work uniform because it was all she had with her, and she had not had time to go back to the sidewalk or wherever her things were stored. A woman answered the door. Young, professional. She said, "Come in, he's expecting you." He was in a room that was more library than office. Bookshelves on every wall. A desk that looked like it had been used for decades. He was standing, not sitting when she came in, which she noticed, which she thought later was deliberate, that he had chosen to stand so she would not feel like she was being called in front of someone. He said hello. She said hello. Then he said, "Your landlord is in violation of 6 city housing codes. The fees he charged you do not exist in any version of the lease. The eviction was illegal. You should never have been put out of that apartment." She stood very still. He said, "There's a housing attorney who can have you back in that apartment within 72 hours if you want to go back. Gerald will be facing a city investigation by end of week. The attorney's fee is already covered." She said, "By you?" He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why?" He looked at her. He did not have a simple answer for that question, and he knew it, and she could see that he knew it. He said, "Because it was wrong. What happened to you was wrong." She said, "Things that are wrong happen to people every day. You don't sit on the sidewalk with all of them." He did not have an answer for that either. He just looked at her steadily and let the silence sit there between them, and he did not try to fill it with something easy. She respected that. She said, "I need to think about the apartment, going back there, with Gerald still in the building." He nodded. He said, "That's fair. Take the 72 hours. She said, "I don't know you." He said, "No." She said, "I don't take things from people I don't know." He said, "I know." She said, "So what is this? What do you actually want?" And here is where another man might have said nothing, or said the wrong thing, or said something smooth and practiced that would have told her everything she needed to know about who he really was. He said, "I don't know yet. I know that I sat on a sidewalk yesterday afternoon for 22 minutes, and I have not been able to think about anything else since. I know that what your landlord did was illegal, and I had the means to look into it, and so I did. I know that I am not asking you for anything, and I am not expecting anything." He paused. "And I know that your daughter told me her rabbit's name was Captain, and that she said it like it was the most important thing in the world, and I have not forgotten that either." She looked at him for a long time. Then she sat down, not because she trusted him completely, but because she was tired of standing, and because something in the way he talked did not sound like a transaction waiting to reveal itself. She sat down and she said, "Tell me exactly what the attorney can do." They talked for an hour and 15 minutes. Not about feelings, not about yesterday, about the lease and the codes, and the process and the timeline. She asked good questions. He noticed that she asked good questions. She had clearly already done research of her own that morning, and she was not starting from zero. She was building on what she already knew, and he found himself leaning forward slightly in his chair, because he was used to meetings where he was the most prepared person in the room, and this woman in a hotel uniform was matching him point for point. When they were done, she stood up and thanked him, and he walked her to the door. At the door, she turned and said, "Your name is on this card, but I don't know who you are. What do you do?" He told her. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "You own the Harrison." He said yes. She said, "I've been staying in your hotel." He said yes. She said, "And you own the hotel where I work?" He was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. She said, "Which hotel group?" He told her. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them. Then she said very quietly, "You own the building where I work." He said, "I own a lot of buildings." She said, "That's not an answer." He said, "Yes, I own the property group that manages the hotel where you work." She stood very still on his doorstep in her uniform, and she looked at him, and something moved across her face that he could not quite read. It was not anger exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was a look of a woman realizing that the thing she thought was random was not entirely random, and that the world she lived in was smaller than she knew, and that the man standing in front of her had far more presence in her daily life than she had understood 30 seconds ago. She said, "I need to go get my daughter." He said, "Of course." She left. He stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the street, and he thought about the fact that he had just made things significantly more complicated, and he was not sure whether he minded. She walked back to Harrison, and she collected her daughter from the very cheerful babysitter, and they went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of the bed while her daughter showed her everything she had drawn in the notepad, and she listened carefully to every drawing, and she said the right things, and she smiled the right way, and inside her chest something was turning over and over. She had worked in his building for 3 years. She had cleaned rooms in a hotel he owned for 3 years. She had taken 2 buses every morning to go make beds in a place that ultimately put money in his pocket for 3 years. She had never known that. She had never had any reason to know that. The man who sat on the sidewalk next to her daughter was also, in a very real sense, her employer's employer's employer. The man who had looked into her lease and found a housing attorney and covered the fee was a man who had been at the top of her professional food chain the entire time, without either of them knowing it. She did not know how to feel about that. She was not sure it was bad. She was not sure it was good. She was sure that it was complicated in a way that required thinking about carefully before doing anything. She called her supervisor. She said she would be in tomorrow. She said everything was fine. Her supervisor said good, and that she had been worried, and that there was a card from some of the other housekeepers on the break room table for her, because word travels in hotels the way word travels in families. She hung up and felt something warm move through her at that. Her people, her actual people, were in that break room with a card on a table. Not the man in the brownstone on the quiet street. Her people. She ordered her daughter another grilled cheese from room service, and she sat by the window while her daughter ate. And she looked out at the city, and she thought about going back to the apartment, about Gerald, about the attorney, about 72 hours. And she thought about the way the man had said, "I don't know yet," when she asked him what he wanted. She turned that answer over in her mind several times. It was either the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, or it was the most sophisticated version of something she should be very careful about. She had not decided which. 3 days later, she was back in her apartment. The attorney had been extraordinary. Gerald had been served with a formal complaint before the end of the week, and the city inspector showed up on Thursday, and what they found in that building was the beginning of something that would take Gerald a very long time to get out from under. The fees were reversed. The eviction was officially voided. She walked back to her front door with her daughter on her hip and Captain under her arm, and she stood in the middle of her small kitchen, and she breathed in the smell of her own space, and her daughter ran to her room, and she heard the sound of small feet on her own floors, and that sound was everything. She had written one text message to the number on the card. It said, "Back in the apartment. Thank you." She had sent it from the doorstep, because she wanted to send it from there specifically, and she was not entirely sure why. He wrote back 4 hours later. He said, "Good." Just that. Good. One word. She stood in her kitchen looking at that one word for longer than was probably reasonable. She put her phone in her pocket and made dinner. 3 weeks passed. She went to work. She came home. She dropped her daughter at Miss Patterson's, who had been so overwhelmed with guilt about the day of the eviction that she had started leaving small containers of food outside her door every few days. She took 2 buses. She made beds. She came home. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She read stories. She set the alarm for 4:30. She did not text him again. He did not text her. Life went back to being what it was, except that her apartment was quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of barely holding on. The quiet of having been tested and not having broken. And then one morning she was on the second bus, the one that went cross down, and she was looking out the window at the city the way she always did, because it was the only 20 minutes of the day that were entirely her own, and she could think or not think as she chose. And the bus stopped at a light, and she looked out and she saw him. He was on the sidewalk outside a coffee shop 2 feet from the bus window. He was in a coat this time. He was looking at his phone. He had not seen her. She had approximately 4 seconds before the light changed. She did not think about it. She knocked on the glass. He looked up. He looked at the bus. He looked at the windows. He found her face. And something happened in his expression that she had not expected. It was not polished. It was not controlled. It was just for a fraction of a second completely unguarded. the face of a man who had been thinking about someone and has suddenly been surprised by them appearing. The light changed. The bus moved. She faced forward in her seat, and she felt her heart doing something undignified in her chest, and she told it to stop it. But she was smiling. She was smiling the whole rest of the way to work. He had looked down at his phone immediately after the bus pulled away. Her name was already in his contacts from the text 3 weeks ago. He stood on the sidewalk with his coffee and his coat, and he typed and deleted and typed and deleted, and then he typed, "I think I just saw you on the 34 crossdown," and sent it before he could think about it anymore. She was walking through the staff entrance of the hotel when it arrived. She read it. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she typed back, "You did?" And then after a pause she typed, "You look surprised." He wrote back immediately, "I was," she wrote, "good surprised or bad surprised?" There was a pause that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he wrote, "Definitely good." She put her phone in her locker. She went to work. She changed linens and vacuumed carpets and restocked minibars and made towel swans, and she felt for the entire 8 hours like there was something small and bright sitting in the center of her chest that had not been there before. She picked up her daughter. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She read stories. She set the alarm. This time before she went to sleep, she looked at the ceiling for a while, and she thought about the fact that she was a 34-year-old woman who worked in a hotel and took 2 buses and lived in a 2-room apartment and wore the same uniform 6 days a week, and there was a man who owned things like hotels and brownstones and property groups who would look surprised and good surprised when he saw her face in a bus window. She thought about all the ways that was complicated. She made a list of them in her head. There were a lot of items on the list. Then she thought about him sitting on the concrete in a $3,000 suit, holding a one-eyed rabbit named Captain. And somehow that one image made the list feel less important. She fell asleep. He called her the following Saturday morning. Not texted. Called. She was at the kitchen table with her daughter and her coffee, and it was the first morning in weeks she did not have to be somewhere, and she almost did not answer because she was not dressed and her hair was not done, and then she laughed at herself for that because he could not see her, and she answered. He said, "Are you busy today?" She looked at her daughter, who was drawing something very intense, involving what appeared to be a horse and a rocket ship. She said, "That depends on what you mean." He said, "I know a place that does the best pancakes in the city. I was told by someone extremely credible that they also have a kids menu with a surprise in it." She said, "Who told you that?" He said, "My assistant. She is a 7-year-old. She said it was non-negotiable." She looked at her daughter again. Her daughter looked up and said, "Who is that?" She said, "A friend." Her daughter went back to the horse and the rocket ship. She said into the phone, "She's 6. He said, "The menu goes to 6. She said, "You asked your assistant about the kids' menu." He said, "I did a lot of research." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Give me an hour." She got her daughter dressed in the yellow dress her daughter chose every time she was given a choice. She put her own hair up because it was faster, and she wore the blue sweater that her sister had sent for her birthday 2 years ago because it was the nicest thing she owned that was not a uniform. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, and she thought about the version of herself from 5 weeks ago standing on that sidewalk in her work clothes looking at her whole life in garbage bags. She said to the mirror, very quietly, just so she could hear herself say it, "You figured it out." Then she took her daughter's hand, and they went. He was already there when they arrived. He was at a corner table, and he was in regular clothes for the first time she had seen him. Jeans, a dark sweater. He looked different, less like a cover and more like a person. Her daughter walked in and looked around at the restaurant with the critical eye of a 6-year-old evaluating an environment. Then she walked directly up to the table and looked at him and said, "Are you the man who held Captain?" He said yes. She said, "Captain wanted me to say thank you." He said, "Please tell Captain it was an honor." Her daughter considered this and then climbed into the chair across from him and picked up the kids' menu and said, "It says there's a surprise." "What is it?" He said, "That's what makes it a surprise." Her daughter thought about this and accepted it. She put her face into the menu. She sat down and looked at him across the table, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence between people who have already seen each other in circumstances that stripped away the small talk, who do not need to start from the beginning, because the beginning already happened on a sidewalk. He said, "You look well." She said, "You look like a person." He raised an eyebrow. She said, "I mean without the suit. You look like a regular person." He said, "I'm a regular person." She gave him a look that said she was not entirely sure about that, but was willing to find out. They ate pancakes. Her daughter got the surprise, which was a small toy rocket ship in a paper bag, and she immediately named it after Captain, and demanded to know if Captain and Captain Rocket could be friends, and he said he did not see why not. She watched him with her daughter, and she watched how he was careful not to try too hard, how he did not perform for the child, how he answered her questions simply and directly the way you talk to a small person when you respect that they are a person. Her daughter was a good judge, always had been. Children who grow up with only one parent to read tend to get very good at reading people. Her daughter was already good at reading people at 6 years old. When they were leaving, her daughter took his hand very naturally at the crosswalk the way children do, and he led her without making a thing, and she walked on one side of him, and she walked on the other, and they stood at the crosswalk together, and she looked down at the top of her daughter's head, and then sideways at the profile of this man, and she thought, carefully and clearly, this is dangerous territory. Not dangerous like bad. Dangerous like real. Dangerous like this matters. Dangerous like if this goes wrong, it will not be a small wrong. She had been careful for 5 years. She had not let things in that could become losses because she already knew what loss did to a life. She had built strong and small and tight, and she had been okay. She had been genuinely okay. This man was not small. He was not contained. He was not the kind of thing that stayed in a neat compartment. The light changed. Her daughter pulled them both forward. She let herself be pulled. Over the following weeks, something slow and careful built between them. He did not rush it. That surprised her. She had expected money to make people impatient, to make them feel like time was a resource they could purchase past. But he did not rush. He texted in the morning, sometimes. He called on Saturday. They met for coffee once when her daughter was at school, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with sidewalks or lease violations or hotel ownership. And she found out that he had grown up in a small apartment not very different from hers, that his mother had worked 2 jobs, that he built everything himself from a starting point that people would have bet against. She told him about her husband. She did not do it all at once. She did it in pieces. The way you give someone something fragile. A piece here, a piece there. Watching to see if they held each piece carefully before you handed them the next one. He held every piece carefully. He told her things, too, about the loneliness of his particular kind of success, about the way everyone around him wanted something, about how he had learned to keep people at a certain distance because closeness had always cost him something, about the Singapore deal, about the board meeting, about the fact that after his divorce 3 years ago, he had sat in that 47th-floor apartment and looked at the view and realized he did not know who he was when nobody was watching. She said, "I know exactly who I am when nobody is watching." He said, "I know. That's what I noticed about you first." She said, "On the sidewalk, you noticed that?" He said, "You told your daughter things were fine when they very clearly were not, and the way you said it was not dishonest. It was protection. There's a difference. You knew the difference. That told me who you were." She looked at him across the coffee table for a long moment. Then she said, "That might be the most specific thing anyone has ever said to me." He said, "I've had a lot of time to think about it." Things were good. Things were quiet and careful and genuinely good. And then they weren't. It started with a photograph. Someone had a photograph in the morning at the pancake place, shot from outside, through the window. Him, her daughter at the crosswalk. It was a good photograph, technically. The kind that told a story without words. It appeared on a gossip site on a Wednesday morning under a headline that she saw on her phone while she was on the first bus on the way to work. The headline said his name and called her Mystery Woman, and said the city's most eligible and famously private businessman had apparently found himself a girlfriend. She read it twice. She sat very still on the bus. She looked at the photograph of the 3 of them at the crosswalk, her daughter's hand in his, her face in profile. Her daughter's face was visible. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature on the bus. She called him before she got to work. He answered immediately, which told her he had already seen it. She said, "My daughter's face is in that photograph." He said, "I know. I'm already on it." She said, "I need it taken down." He said, "It'll be down within the hour. I promise." She said, "That is not a promise you can make. Things don't come down. They get shared. They get saved. She is 6 years old, and her face is on the internet because she was standing next to you." He was quiet. She said, "I need to think." She hung up. She went to work. She changed linens and vacuumed carpets and restocked minibars and made towel swans. And for 8 hours, she thought about what it meant to be in the life of a man whose face on the internet dragged everyone near him into a frame they did not choose to be in. Her daughter had not chosen that frame. Her daughter was 6 years old and had named a toy rocket ship after a stuffed rabbit, and that was the only thing her daughter should have to think about right now. She picked up her daughter from Miss Patterson. Her daughter had not seen anything. Her daughter asked if they could have pasta for dinner. She made pasta. After her daughter was asleep, she sat in the kitchen in the quiet, and she thought about all of it for a long time. About the list she had made of the ways this was complicated. About how the list was getting longer. About the 2-room apartment and the 2 buses, and the uniform and the man in the 47th-floor apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows, and whether those 2 worlds could actually exist in the same life without one of them being crushed by the weight of the other. She was not afraid of being crushed. She had survived crushing before. She was afraid of her daughter being crushed. She texted him. She said, "I think we need to talk." He wrote back, "I know. I'll come to you when it's good." She said, "Tomorrow evening, after 7. He said, "I'll be there." He came to the apartment. For the first time. He came to the 2 rooms, and the sometimes heat, and the drawings on the refrigerator, and the one-eyed rabbit on the shelf, and the kitchen table, where she had made her list for 5 years. She made coffee. He sat at the table. He looked around the apartment in a way that was not evaluating it. He looked around it the way you look around a place that tells you who someone really is. She sat across from him with her coffee. She said, "I have a daughter." He said, "I know." She said, "She is the first thing. She is always the first thing. Before anything else. Before me. Before anything that might be good for me. She comes first." He said, "That's not something I would ever ask you to change." She said, "The life you live is a public life. I am not a public person. She is not a public child." He said, "You're right." She said, "I don't know how those 2 things can exist together without her being exposed to something she can't consent to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about that too. Since Wednesday morning I've thought about very little else." She said, "And?" He said, "I don't have a perfect answer. I don't think there is one. But I want you to know that I am aware that the risk in this is not mine. You are the one with something to lose that cannot be replaced. I am the one who has to be worth that risk. And I understand if you decide I'm not." She looked at him. She said, "You are not going to make this easy, are you?" He said, "I'm going to try to make it right. Easy and right aren't always the same thing." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She looked at it for a while. Then she said, "She asked about you. This morning. She asked if you were coming back." He was very still. She said, "I told her I didn't know." He said, "What do you want me to say? Right now? Whatever you want me to say, I'll say it." She looked up at him. She said, "I want you to say something true." He said, "I think about you every day. I think about her every day. I sat in that apartment on the 47th floor for 3 years looking at that view and not feeling anything. And I have not stopped feeling things since I sat on that sidewalk. And that is terrifying to me because I built my entire life on being in control, and I have 0 control over this." He paused. "That's the true thing." She did not say anything for a long time. Outside the apartment, the city moved and hummed and went about its business of being enormous and indifferent. Inside the 2-room apartment, at the kitchen table with the coffee and the drawings on the refrigerator and the one-eyed rabbit on the shelf, there were 2 people sitting across from each other in the particular silence of something that has not yet been decided. She said, "I need you to understand something about me." He said, "Tell me." She said, I am not a rescue. I am not a project. I am not something that happened to you on a sidewalk that you're following up on because it made you feel something. I am a person. I have a whole person inside me that has been working very hard for a very long time, and I am not interested in being the thing that makes a man feel alive again. I am interested in someone who is already alive and wants to be alive alongside someone who is also already alive. He was very still. He said, that is one of the most important things anyone has ever said to me. She said, I mean it. He said, I know. That's why it's important. She looked at him. Then she said, I'll think about it. He said, that's all I'm asking. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He looked around the apartment once more. He looked at the drawings on the refrigerator for a moment. Then he looked at her and said, thank you for the coffee. And he left. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time after the door closed. Then she got up and looked at the drawings on the refrigerator. Her daughter's drawings. The horse and the rocket ship. A picture of the two of them holding hands under a big yellow sun. A drawing of Captain with a note that said Captain in wobbly letters. And at the very back, half hidden by the others, a new one she had not seen before. A drawing of 3 people at a table. A woman, a little girl, and a tall figure with a dark sweater. Under it in wobbly letters it said, the man who held Captain. She stood at the refrigerator in her kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, and she put her hand over her mouth, and she felt the full weight of everything she was carrying, and everything she stood to gain, and everything she stood to lose all at once. And it was a weight that no list could organize and no plan could contain. She left the drawing where it was. She went to bed. She did not set the alarm that night. For the first time in 5 years, she did not set the alarm. Not because she had forgotten, but because she needed one single night, where the morning could come when it came, and she would meet it when she met it. She lay in the dark. She thought about all the things she knew and all the things she did not know, and about a man who said easy and right aren't always the same thing, and about a little girl who drew 3 people at a table, and about a one-eyed rabbit named Captain who had started all of it. She thought about the word alongside, about what it meant to be alongside someone rather than behind them, or beneath them, or in the orbit of them, about whether that was possible, about whether she was brave enough to find out. Outside the window the city hummed. She closed her eyes, and somewhere on the 47th floor a man who had built his entire life on control sat in the dark with his floor, the ceiling windows, and his city view, and thought about a woman who knew exactly who she was when nobody was watching, and thought about the fact that he wanted very badly to be the one watching, and thought about a drawing on a refrigerator he had not seen, but somehow already knew existed. He thought about all of this for a long time. Then he reached over and turned off the light, and the city kept going, as cities do, as cities always have, not pausing for complicated quiet business of 2 people deciding whether to be brave. But that is the thing about cities. They did not need to pause. The important things happen in their own time, in 2-room apartments and 47th floor penthouses, and on sidewalks with garbage bags and broken furniture, and one-eyed rabbits named Captain. The important things happen when a child is alone and a stranger sits down. The important things happen when a woman says, we'll figure it out, and means it. The important things happen in the space between easy and right, in the long, careful work of 2 people deciding that the other one is worth being afraid for. They happened here. They are still happening. And that, for now, is exactly enough.